Let's go. So I'm Paul Edwards. I'm the director of the Science, Technology, and Society program at Stanford, and you are seeing the next lecture in the Race in Medicine series. This is part three of a three-part series. Those of you who have been with us all along know that it's a course as well as a public event. And so we reserve our Q&A time mainly for the undergrads in this class. We have been sponsored by numerous units on the campus. This particular talk had extra sponsorship and support from the Ethics Society and Technology Hub. And all these other units played a part in choosing speakers, inviting them, and getting us going through this whole long process. We always begin with a land acknowledgement to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. That's where Stanford is, on that land. It belongs to them. It's still of a great importance to them, so our values of community and diversity give us the responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. The land acknowledgement will be in the chat, and you can visit their website if you'd like to learn more about the Ohlone. Next time, we have our own Subini Anama from the School of Education talking about her book on the pedagogy of pathologization. So that'll be next week at this same time. And just a reminder, please keep your microphone muted. Undergrads, please put your full name on Zoom so we know who you are. And please, faculty and staff, if you have questions or comments, do not hesitate to enter them in the chat, but hang back on speaking the questions out loud because we'll organize that at the end. Sometimes Jasmine or I will read a question aloud instead of turning it over to the students. And as always, especially in this really difficult time, which has just gotten really difficult again with the trial of Derek Chauvin and another police murder and more and more and more. It just seems to never stop. Anyway, please be respectful and kind. And now I'll turn it over to who's next here, actually.
Turn it over to Colin Anthony Chen.
Okay, please.
All right. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Jasmine. I'm really thrilled to be a part of this fascinating and impactful and important event series. As said, my name is Colin Anthony Chen, and I'm the Associate Director of Undergraduate Outreach at the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society, which was one of the long co-sponsors, the various co-sponsors of this talk. And one of the main goals of our center is to really encourage research and public engagement with moral challenges facing our society today. And really, this past year alone has brought numerous deep and entrenched ethical problems to the foreground that are really impossible for our society to ignore. Whether it is, as just mentioned by Paul, the painful awareness of continuing racial injustice, or the deeply unequal effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So our center, along with the many partners on campus, aim to really shed light on aspects of these urgent moral problems as a starting point for future dialogue and research at the Stanford community. So there are many undergraduates in the audience right now. So if you are a student who is interested in getting involved in exploring these many moral problems, whether it's through an event or something else that you'd be interested in exploring with me, I encourage you to reach out to learn more about our opportunities. Moving on, I am now honored to introduce our guest speaker this afternoon, Professor Keith Wailoo. And Professor Wailoo is the Henry Putnam University Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He is also the former Vice Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs. He's the former chair of the History Department and the current president of the American Association for the History of Medicine. His research focuses on the intersection between history and health policy, covering areas such as drugs and drug policy, the politics of race and health, the role of identity, ethnicity, gender, and medicine, and on various controversies in genetics and society. He's also a prolific and an award-winning author, publishing numerous books on race, ethnicity, and medicine. His upcoming book, to be released this year by the University of Chicago Press, is called Pushing Cool: Big Tobacco, Racial Marketing, and the Untold Story of the Menthol Cigarette. He's also a deep public intellectual in addition to an academic researcher. He has written for the New York Times. He's made appearances on NPR, C-SPAN, and served on numerous advisory boards in medicine and health policy. So it is indeed an honor to have him as our guest this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Professor Wailoo for his talk, Pain with a Psychogenetic Overlay: Gender, Race, and the Political Ethics of Pain Relief in the US. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Jasmine, for the invitation, and Colin in particular for that wonderful introduction. And what I hope to do is to give you a taste of the kind of work that I've done surrounding the question of pain in relationship to the politics of identity. I should say that I'll talk for about 40 minutes, and I really look forward to engaging with you, particularly the undergraduates, but all of you around the issues that I'll highlight. So I'm really delighted to join you and to talk about science and ethics, particularly in this talk, medical ethics as related to the question of chronic pain, and I guess broadly understood, whose pain matters and whose pain, broadly speaking, deserves attention and relief. I wrote a book about pain and political history, and I've also written about the history of sickle cell disease, in which the question of pain, as it is understood in medicine, but as it's treated more generally in society, is the central problematic. And these issues of whose pain matters are not just questions of race, but as I hope to show you today, also inflected by questions about gender and pain. And I was told in conversation with Paul and Jasmine that for all of the rich conversations around race in medicine that's part of this series, that there was interest in looking at how questions of race and are related to broader issues of social identity. And it's with that in mind that I thought I would turn my attention to the question of gender and pain. So the topic today, pain with a psychogenic overlay: gender, race, and the political ethics of pain relief in American society. Okay, let me just see if I can move my slides here. Yeah. So I came into the question of pain through the lens, as I said, of race, and through the study of sickle cell disease in the United States in the second book that I wrote. And I just want to kind of illustrate very quickly the approach that I took there and how it translates into this conversation today. So sickle cell disease is a disorder that's known and characterized by frequent infections, early mortality, predominantly seen as a hemoglobinopathy in the United States that's specific to African American or people of African descent, but also characterized by these unique and recurring painful crises. And when I tracked the history of sickle cell disease, what I found fascinating is that its rise to clinical awareness in the 1960s mapped onto a broader social awareness that sickle cell disease in the 1960s was characterized as a new disease that was characterized by pain and suffering among African Americans that had long been ignored. And you can see, therefore, how social awareness of a disorder or a condition or an experience of Black folks resonated with the changing political and cultural currents of the era. So the message here is that you might say pain has a history. There are times in which we pay attention to the pain of particular people, and there are other times in which we dismiss those pains. Pain also has a geography. I studied a city called Memphis, Tennessee in the Mid-South, and there I interviewed different researchers, one of whom noted in a oral history that there was a kind of geographical variation in how physicians thought about sickle cell pain. He wrote that people in Oakland and Chicago disagree with us in Memphis. They think that we undertreat people in sickle cell crisis, and we think they overtreat people in sickle cell crisis. So pain has a history and it has a geography, and history changed so that by the 1990s, what had been a kind of a liberal understanding of this as a new disease that warranted clinical attention and medical relief was running into a slightly more skeptical era. You have stories in that era of patients confronted with increasing skepticism, frustration from nurses and ER doctors who think perhaps that they are faking pain or perhaps are drug seeking. And it creates new kinds of challenges for people in pain, chronic pain. The image on the front of my book is taken from a 1990s news article, which had a caption underneath it that said, before you can get past the agony, you have to convince a doctor that it's real. So what I'd like to do today is to sort of take this approach to pain, that is the meaning of pain is a complex scientific and medical concern that's often entangled with concerns of identity, ethics, and social policy. You might say there's a micropolitics of pain, as in how do doctors think about people in pain? Are they really in crisis? How aggressively do we treat them? With what kinds of drugs? And then there's a macropolitics of pain. That is to say, whose pain matters, a question of clinical care, but also of public policy and social welfare. And in the work that I do, these questions, these micro questions and these macro questions intersect. And they find themselves, they become evident around questions like, how do you convince a doctor that your pain is real? Questions about whether a form of pain relief is financially too costly. You also have the questions around the use of pain drugs like opioids. That is to say, is the kind of relief that might be effective also producing new kinds of dependency and social problems? So all of these questions, these macro political questions and these micro political questions, really figure in the long history of pain as a controversial problem in American medicine and society. And so today what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about how gender, social identity, particularly gendered identity, figures in the changing ethics of pain relief. This cartoon here really is a good example of the doctor who has to sort of make that determination at the bedside. As this doctor in this New York cartoon says, we can give you enough medication to alleviate the pain, but not enough to make it fun. And so the question is really, where is the line between the relief of pain and the creation of pleasure? This question of how you measure pain, how you understand pain, has been fraught for a number of reasons, and I'd want to take you through a few of them. And one starts with the question of measurement. Reliable measurement. Pain is necessarily subjective. The expert depends on the individual patient and secondary indices like vital signs to say how much pain someone is in. We don't have the kind of objective measures of blood pressure and temperature and other so-called vital signs to tell us as experts how much pain somebody's actually experiencing. There are also these lingering clinical worries about what are called secondary gain, the idea that really patients are just drug seekers, that they may be in pain, but they're really seeking something else, and that this could lead down a worrisome path towards drug dependency and addiction. And then throughout this, there's always a question of, how clinicians and how experts evaluate the person in pain and determine whose pain really warrants relief. Just to give you a concrete example of the kinds of ethical dilemmas that emerge in this troubling, vexing area of pain. Pain at the end of life is a quintessential example of, how difficult it is to draw proper ethical lines and proper moral lines about when pain is worthy of relief. End-of-life pain, we know, can be relieved efficaciously by morphine. Morphine also suppresses blood pressure and inhibits respiration. And there's a point at which it surely provides relief, but it also hastens death. And so for clinicians who are interested in and committed to compassion at the end of life for, let's say, the cancer patient, where is the line between truly compassionate pain relief and euthanasia, or physician-assisted suicide, or even murder? These are the kinds of tangled ethical dilemmas that swirl around the question of pain, as well as questions of welfare and dependency, who is truly disabled, and really, how do you judge the worthy pain complainant? Pain is a sign. It's like pulse, it's like blood pressure, it's like respiration, it's like temperature, but it's not a vital sign in the same sense. It's a symptom, and as such, a lot of clinicians and medical experts think of it as both subjective but somewhat undependable. It requires a certain amount of intersubjective understanding, so that when one of the founders of the field, John Bonica, was asked in 1974, what is pain? He said, and whether science can actually define the sensation. He says, if you ask 100 different authorities that question, you get 100 different answers. So what I found in the history of pain, to kind of end my introduction here, is that pain exposes these lingering problems of objective and subjective evidence in medicine, in science, in law, and in politics. And what I was surprised by is the extent to which it is not scientists and physicians who decide whose pain matters in both the clinic and in society, but it's by and large the courts that have to weigh these questions and determine who warrants what kinds of relief. In what follows, I'd like to take you through 4 examples in the history of pain, which intersect with questions of gender and these broader ethical questions in pain, in science and pain relief. My first example is drawn from the 1950s, an era before pain was really seen as a widely understood and acceptable clinical reality that warranted relief. And to capture that, I'd say that this is an era in which physicians were either disregarding pain or bemoaning the fact that they were not very good at taking care of people in chronic pain, and spent a lot of time worrying about the identity of the pain complainant. As one Boston psychiatrist wrote in 1959, the relief of pain is obviously one of the main functions of physicians, but ironically, it's one of the things we do least well, partly because we don't understand it. More skeptically, and here I'd say that the stance espoused by Henry L. Bronda, a California psychiatrist, was one of intense ethical skepticism. At a pain symposium in California in 1957, he said that the patient in chronic pain was worthy of study, certainly, but not necessarily worthy of sympathy. He wrote that complaints of chronic pain, quote, may develop in the child brought up to repress feelings of hatred, who then may use those complaints of pain to cover his hostile feelings towards an associate. These were physicians who were worried not so much about pain, but about the pain complainant, seeing in them malingering or masochistic self-punishment that underlies the chronic painful condition. So chronic pain was as much a psychological and psychiatric problem as it was an organic problem to be dealt with. And these issues of malingering and deception or playing sick have not entirely disappeared from medicine, but they figured very prominently for this generation of physicians thinking about what to do with chronic pain. If Henry L. Bronda was really concerned about chronic pain, it was also because in the 1950s, there was a new move afoot in California, but also nationally, to expand the benefits associated with disability. And that is under the Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, who had just that year signed a new law establishing Social Security disability benefits. And one of the questions that troubled many physicians was pain a true disability? What evidence established compensable disability? In the first years of the establishment of this system under the Health and Education and Welfare Leader, HHS, Health and Human Services, a patient might bring their request for relief and disability before the agency and might be rejected on the basis of the evidence. One of those people rejected was Rosie Page, a Texas housewife who had been in and out of the workforce since the end of World War II. Her doctors characterized her pain as caused by arthritis with a marked psychogenic overlay, which is where I got the title for this talk. And she applied for benefits. She was rejected by HEW. And if you're rejected at this time for these disability benefits, you have a recourse for appeal to the federal courts. And it's the courts that were adjudicating who was really, whether pain of this type warranted disability benefits. In trying to understand what the psychogenic overlay meant at the time, I sort of delved into the characterizations, definitions of psychogenic pain in the British Medical Journal and the American Medical Journals, and found that it's often associated, surprise, surprise, maybe not so surprising, with women. As this particular article from the 30s noted, the subject of psychogenic pain may continue for months under her affliction, but such a state of affairs is incompatible with the continued presence of true pain. So psychogenic pain juxtaposed with true pain. It is in young hysterical women, says the author, that this striking discrepancy between the alleged intensity of psychogenic pain and the physical condition is most often seen. It's therefore reasonable to be urged that psychogenic pain is not pain in any precise sense of the word. These are the kinds of debates surrounding psychogenic pain, or even closer to the date of the Page v. Celebrezze case, the British Medical Journal writes, pain of emotional origins has long been referred to as hysterical. The term hysterical, however, they argue should be discarded and the more descriptive title of psychogenic regional pain preferred. So psychogenic pain doing some of the same work that hysterical pain had done. The Page v. Celebrezze case also emerges at a time when the status of women, married women moving in and out of industry across the lines of work, labor force participation, and work at home is emerging as a new phenomenon in post-war American society. And you might say the question about whether this pain is compensable or not is also shaped by this broader question, not just of psychogenic pain or arthritis pain or the pain of women, but the status of women in the workforce at the time. This takes us to the second example, because it's this question of whether Rosie Page's pain warrants disability relief that finds its way in 1963 to the courts. And it's a landmark ruling by a Republican appointee of Eisenhower, a guy named John R. Brown, who worked in the Fifth Circuit, that really establishes that Rosie Page's pain is an acceptable form of pain that warrants liberal social relief. He writes, if pain is real to the patient, the disability entitles the person to the statutory benefits. The fact that pain complained of by the claimant is not shown by objective clinical and laboratory findings does not mean that HEW must give little weight to allegations thereof. So this is an irony of our time if you think about pain through the lens of politics. A Republican appointee following the establishment of a law signed into a bill signed into law by a Republican president, but establishing a new liberal benefit of recognizing subjective pain as real pain. It's a kind of a liberal ethical stance that stands in really contrast to that ethical skepticism that I characterized earlier, really echoing the thoughts of people like John Stuart Mill, that human beings themselves, that the whole point of liberal ethics is to bring human beings themselves nearer to the best things that they can be. Pain ethics and pain science and pain care is about to enter a much more liberal era in the early 1960s. And part of the driving force is a new scientific theory of pain that validates subjective pain even more as central and important in clinical medicine. It's the gate control theory of pain. That's the brainchild of not physicians, but two scientists, Ronald Melzack, a psychologist at McGill, and Patrick Wall, a physiologist at MIT. And they argue in the early 1960s that the concept of the anatomical realities of pain, that pain exists in the brain, that there's a pain center in the brain, for instance, is totally inadequate to account for the sequence of behavior and experience. The concept, they argue, is pure fiction. Pain really is manifested pain is perceived at multiple places in the brain. And they come up with this model of the gate control theory, to borrow it from electronics, that suggests that pain moves along fibers, and that there are gates that prompt and can that can cause the transmission of pain impulses, but the gates can open and close based on a lot of different factors: one's past history, the social context, the personal context of pain, one's personality traits, one's previous history with pain, etc. Ronald Melzack later explained that the gate theory of pain really led to a kind of liberalization in the way we think about not just subjective pain as real pain, but the liberalization in approaches to pain. He wrote that gate control theory rode in on a zeitgeist, and he himself was astonished by its acceptance in the 1960s, in the 1970s. But one of the things it did is that it endorsed liberal approaches to pain, chronic pain, whether the use of tranquilizers, relaxants, placebo, suggestion, hypnosis, etc., all deserved more attention than they had previously done. And the other liberalizing trend in pain is that it liberalized, you might say, the liberalizing trend opened up new issues in society, ethics, and medicine. For instance, there's a book written in the late 1960s called People in Pain, which is based on a study of ethnic groups in a VA hospital in New York. Looked at in retrospect, you can say this is either a book that is the crudest form of ethnic stereotyping or the arrival of cultural sensitivity in pain, because what Mark Zabrowski did is interview patients, and he came up with this sort of ethnic typology of different people in pain, that he characterized Jewish patients in this hospital as being very vocal about their pain, suspicious of doctors, and always concerned about pain. Italians were seen as vocal, but also trusting of physicians and also present oriented. That is, if the pain was present, they complained, but if it wasn't, it was as if it didn't exist. The Irish in this context were seen as what you might call pathologically stoic, ignoring pain often to their own detriment, did not, as if it didn't exist, and highly suspicious to boot of medical authority. And of course, it was the old Americans, which were the Anglo-Americans, who knew exactly how to communicate pain to the largely old Americans or Anglo-American physicians. They knew how to rationalize pain and how to avoid sort of being misread as patients who were not truly in pain, but acting out. So this is an example of how pain was being grappled with in the late 1960s as a new phenomenon, and the pain field was coming into its own. So the pain field itself was being born in this time period in a much more multidisciplinary setting. It's also a time period that gives us innovations like patient-controlled analgesia. And that is the idea that rather than the physician judging whether the patient is in pain or not, give the patient access to the morphine drip in a controlled medical setting so that they can determine what extent of relief they need. Or building on Ronald Melzack's work, the pain questionnaire, which we all have probably been subject to in a hospital at some point, which is on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst pain you've ever had, how would you rate your pain? So ask the patient how much pain they're in. This is a kind of example of the liberalizing trends in pain that validate patient's experience as not just worthy of a place in the medical conversation, but really worthy of relief. There are many other examples of how pain medicine is being liberalized that I could go into: the rise of acupuncture, the emergence, and that's a picture of Patrick Wall, who ends up becoming an innovator of a new way of treating pain called the transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, or TENS units, that you see pictured here. So pain is being liberalized along a lot of different angles. What I want to leave you with as I move into part 3 is this notion that there's a skeptical tradition of being wary about people in pain and their professions of pain. And there is also a liberal tradition that is emerging to kind of give people in pain a place in society, and a route towards relief, whether through medicine or through broader social welfare programs. And this comes into tension starting in the 1980s. That kind of skepticism is resurgent in the 1980s, wedded to a new kind of conservatism. And here the story also starts in California, which I'll get to in a second. But it's in 1984, one health researcher notes that over the past 20 years, a significant number of federal cases of disability under this new kind of liberal approach, or in which alleged disabilities were wholly or substantially related to pain. So there's this argument that a significant number of the expansion of the so-called welfare state is largely riding on the back of this liberal understanding of pain. And so what you have played out in the 60s through the 80s is, you might say, this tension between a liberal ethic of pain, the notion that relief in the name of compassion is a social good, in service of social justice, recognizing individuality, valuing subjective experience as important, and in the name of intersubjective understanding. But there's this ongoing conservative social ethic that's concerned with the social consequences of indulging subjective complaints, feeding addiction, fostering dependency, and malingering, or a new term that emerges called learned helplessness. So by the 1970s into 1980s, you begin to see even the pain practitioners being anxious about what they have created. In Atlanta, Stephen Brenna, a pain specialist, writes a book on chronic pain in which he argues that chronic pain is often a conditioned socioeconomic disease. And the majority of patients show pain behavior in excess of biomedical findings, and because society had gone too far in granting monetary compensation for escape from work via the complaint of pain. And he writes about something called the learned pain syndrome. Pain judges who are weighing those HEW, HHS disability cases themselves are rethinking liberal approaches to pain. In the 1970s, pain, says one ruling, Miranda v. Richardson, is not easily diagnosed, but the secretary is not at the mercy of every claimant's subjective assertions of pain when determining eligibility. And this runs headlong into the Reagan Revolution. Former governor from California who becomes president in 1980, takes office in January 1981. And one of the first aspects of his agenda, and of course in a previous run for president, Reagan of course railed against the rise of government and the role of social welfare programs, and in 76 vilified the welfare queen, that is a Black woman in Chicago who was characterized as someone who had used welfare to enrich herself rather than for what it was initially designed as a welfare programs for those truly in need. There's a deep skepticism about whether government has produced a problem rather than solved one. And in Reagan's White House, Peter Ferraro, one of his policymakers, writes, over the years, the disability benefit provisions were significantly over-liberalized as compared with the original concept of paying such benefits only for truly permanent and total disability. And so it's on the basis of this skepticism about government, but also the skepticism about pain, that the Reagan administration rolls back the disability rolls back the definition of disability so that it would rest solely on medical grounds and would not take into account what are called vague factors, which are too difficult and consistent to measure. In the first years of the Reagan administration, about 490,000 people are removed from the disability rolls, many of whom are claiming pain as the source of their disability. And many of them go to the courts. And it is another woman, Lorraine Pulaski, in a class action suit. And Lorraine Pulaski is actually from Hennepin County, not so far from where the most recent police shooting tragedy occurred in Minnesota. And it's her case that becomes a test case, much like the Rosie Page case in the 1960s. Once again, calling on the courts to define where, what warrants true relief. And here you see a new kind of phenomenon in the ethics of pain relief, in which the courts are trying to thread the needle between these conservative concerns and these liberal commitments. And I won't go into details, but what this particular ruling says is, here's how you measure pain. The claimant has the burden of proving that the disability results from a medically determinable physical and mental impairment, but direct medical evidence of the cause and effect relationship between the impairment and the degree of the claimant's subjective complaints don't need to be produced. And the adjudicator, the judge, may not disregard a claimant's subjective complaints solely because the objective medical evidence does not support them. So this takes me, you might say, so this is an era, and we live still in this era in which what we're trying to do in the navigating the fraught politics of chronic pain is to figure out how these liberal commitments can be meshed or merged or reconciled with the conservative skepticisms that have lingered. And this takes us really into a kind of the new politics of pain that I want to kind of just illustrate where it goes next. As when John Bonica reaches the end of his life in 1994, a new politics of pain has emerged, and it's pain relief at the end of life. These very issues I started to talk about at the very beginning, the question of physician-assisted suicide, where is the line between compassionate pain relief and euthanasia? And as the state of Oregon passes its physician-assisted suicide law, first once and then a second time, you have a backlash brewing among now religious conservatives, people like Henry Hyde, a Republican congressman from Illinois, who proposes an act called the Pain Relief Promotion Act in 1999, which is really not a pain relief promotion act so much as a way of threatening physicians who dispense controlled substances for the purposes of hastening death, that the DEA will come after them. So there's a new politics of pain, you might say, at the end of life, and the question of sort of where is the line between these liberal commitments in a place like Oregon and the religious anxieties and concerns of people like Henry Hyde and others. And once again, it is the courts that have to decide both morally, legally, and ethically where that line is. When the Supreme Court weighs the question of the constitutionality of the right to die, what they decide is that there is no such right. But the American Medical Association files an amicus brief that allows the court to embrace a kind of a middle ground. The AMA rejects physician-assisted suicide as both morally and ethically abhorrent, but they support pain relief even if it hastens death, invoking the ethical principle of double effect. They write in their amicus brief, the recognition that physicians should provide patients pain medication sufficient to ease their pain, even where that may serve to hasten death, is vital to ensuring that no patient suffer from physical pain. What the AMA is actually doing here by invoking the principle of double effect is articulating, reaching back to a principle that was articulated in the 13th century by Thomas Aquinas, a principle that was articulated for how to proceed amid moral complexity when a legitimate and good act may cause a result one that would otherwise one would be obliged to avoid. And it's this principle that the swing justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, agrees allows the court to invalidate the idea that there is a right to die, and yet allow the physician-assisted suicide law in Oregon or other kinds of palliative care to exist and be moral, ethical, and legal. And she writes, there is no dispute that dying patients in Washington and New York can obtain palliative care, even when doing so would hasten their deaths. There is, as with the case with Rosie Page and Lorraine Pulaski, a gender dimension to this that is fraught. When Jack Kevorkian becomes a kind of a well-known figure for pushing physician-assisted suicide to the point of actually administering this drug concoction himself and filming it and serving and going to prison for it. But it's commented on as the fact that most of the first people who took advantage of Kevorkian's service were women. And there was therefore a feminist critique of Kevorkian, which argued that, what kind of service is this that is, at least in its earliest incarnation, victimizing women? And how did gender figure in these early euthanasia debates? Are women's requests for aid in dying honored more often than men's or less? Feminist arguments in this particular article point out that feminist arguments can support conclusions either that gendered perceptions of women as self-sacrificing predispose physicians to accede to women's request to die, or that cultural understandings of women are not fully rational, that lingering psychogenic overlay lead physicians to reject their requests as irrational. There's another way in which gender figured in the new politics of pain that we're currently living through. And that is the 1980s also produced another kind of moral, religious, conservative debate about whose pain matters, focusing not on women's pain, but on fetal pain. And this was a kind of an invention, you might say. Neurologically speaking, it's very hard to argue that fetuses feel pain until they have neurological development. But in the right to life politics, fetal pain became a rallying point for people like Henry Hyde and others who were arguing against abortion rights. And so what you have in the 1980s and 1990s is this really perverse new politics of whose pain matters, where you have some groups on the right arguing that the pains that matter are the pains before life begins, and others who argue from the left that compassionate pain at the end of life is what matters. And so you might say that this really illustrates the way in which pain becomes politicized and how the people in pain, the adults living with pain, sort of are pushed out of the centerpiece of the discussion as the pain politics fragments. It's kind of a splintering of worldviews that echo the broader splintering of politics. And this image is actually taken from the review in Science magazine of my book, in which you have the politics of pain illustrated using these the donkey and the elephant. So I will end there, having given you this very quick snapshot of a window into the entanglement of science, ethics, and social policy around the question of pain. Really an illustration of why pain has been so controversial for so long in medicine society, and how gender concerns in particular figure in this fraught politics of pain. It's a story that I capture in the book Pain, A Political History, which is a broad overview of the political and cultural turmoil, as well as the ethical challenges surrounding, giving proper relief. It's not, therefore, just a question of pain measurement. It's not just a question of opioids, which I haven't spoken about here in the interest of time. It is fundamentally a question revolving around questions of dependence, disability, and work, and the character of society more generally. And then fundamentally, what I'd like to argue is a lot of our current debate is fragmented and fractured, not around the question of whether pain matters, but around the question of whose pain matters. And in the fragmentation, what you have is also a story about how women in chronic pain have been caught, you might say, in the middle of these pitched battles. So in 2010, when the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, said that we needed to kind of rethink how we deal with pain, one of the things that they said is we need a cultural transformation in the way pain is viewed and treated. And in some ways, a lot of the work I've done in the Dying in the City of the Blues, on the sickle cell history, or on the history of pain, or today in the story of gender and pain, is an effort to illustrate exactly what that cultural debate has been like, and why it is that it is true that we need still a transformation in the way in which pain is understood and discussed. So I'll end there. I've given you probably more to think about than is wise in such a short space of time. I probably talked too long as well, but happy to chat going forward about science, ethics, race, medicine, or pain, or whatever you'd like.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So much rich detail that you sent to us, that you gave to us. Not too much. There's a lot to chew on, and we already have a number of students who have some questions. So I would actually like to pick up right where you ended, where, as you were talking about sort of the fact that like women are often caught in this, in the interstices of these politicized debates about pain, but also women who live intersectional lives are probably caught in even more of a difficult situation. So one of the questions we have is, does the argument about psychogenic pain and the development of psychogenic pain as an analytic, does it have any influence on the forced sterilization of women of color? And what is the relationship between sort of the histories of forced sterilization and the way that women's pain is described?
Right. Well, let me start by saying that would make a brilliant project of some kind. I'm not somebody who has the answers to all these things, but I recognize a good question when I hear one, and that's a good one. So I guess the way I would respond to start is that the practice of forced sterilization presupposes that certain kinds of how to put it, that it already starts by diminishing the significance of certain kinds of lives and certain capacities for self-determination. Whether it is also a diminishing of the capacity to feel pain, I can't say, because I have not studied the kind of the discourse and the politics of pain as it emerges in the debate about forced sterilization. But if you look at the other stuff that I've done, there's a long history of debate about whether Black people feel pain differently or have tougher skins. And when I talked to this group last 2 quarters ago, I guess, one of the things I assigned was a piece I wrote, which emerged because of this incredibly shocking study that was done in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, where medical students had these ideas that Black folks had thicker skins and higher pain tolerance, and that somehow could translate into differences in pain care. So to study forced sterilization and psychogenic pain in women, one would have to kind of delve into the logic of how scientists, physicians, practitioners, and policymakers were thinking about pain in order to connect to those dots. So it's quite possible, but I can't say that that's the crucial dynamic there.
Yeah, thank you. And the question I was going to ask next actually does take this study that came out to task. And so I'll read it. You've already mentioned it, but I'll read the question out just so that other people who may not be as familiar have some sort of grounding for it. So according to a 2016 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, 40% of first and second year medical students agreed with the statement that, quote, Black people's skin is thicker than white people's, end quote, when surveyed. A medical textbook publisher also came under fire in 2017 for perpetuating false stereotypes regarding delivering pain relief to ethnic groups. And the question that the student has is, why are these false beliefs? So if you could actually delve into a little bit more about, if you want to kind of sketch out a genealogy of why these false beliefs continue to be perpetuated, what is keeping these false beliefs essentially in circulation, especially at such high level of study and of practice?
Oh gosh. Let me start by saying that as a historian of medicine who has studied the history of ideas about gender, social difference, race, and medical theory, I'm well versed in the history of wonderful colleague at University of Michigan, Martin Pernick, wrote a book called A Calculus of Suffering, in which he talked about the rise of anesthesia, chloroform and ether, and how it gave rise to a kind of fascinating array of theories about how women of a certain class, Black people, Native Americans, all experience pain differently. And in some ways, Mark Zabrowski's work that I highlighted continues in that tradition. That is to say, there is in some way, there is a liberal history of difference that says people of different cultural background experience pain differently, perhaps because of learned cultural inheritances. So that notion has continued to animate medicine. And so you can actually interview physicians and you hear about ethnic social differences in childbirth behavior that map onto ethnicity or cultural difference. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's been an ongoing conversation about race, ethnicity, culture, and pain difference. The fact that the PNAS and others kind of suddenly discovered that medical students also, without any scientific, without any medical, without any training at all, without any, have these ideas, I have to admit, it made me think, well, what century am I in? Because these were well-developed theories through the 19th century and into the 20th century, but they largely kind of disappeared. These notions of thickness of the skin, blood coagulate. I mean, one of the theories was that the Black people's blood coagulates at a different rate. I mean, it was fantastic in the sense, in literally in the. So I, for one, do not understand where these notions come from, unless they come from a place where that we often don't pay attention to, which is things like oral tradition, things like ingrained racial attitudes that really defy education. In the same places that we live in a time period in which people have a lot of views that defy science, right? Well, maybe what that article is putting its finger on is the idea that this kind of these ingrained cultural notions of difference are able to persist regardless of whether we think education has a salutary effect, or whether we think that science has a way of supplanting and pushing aside these notions. And the last thing I'll say is, I don't want to. I taught in North Carolina for for many years and early in my career. And, I was surprised that, really smart students are very well versed in certain ideas that I thought had long been sort of pushed aside. So I'll give you one quick example, which is that I was teaching one year on the history of early America. And for people who study the history of slavery, there is intellectuals in the South had a pro-slavery argument, which had to do with the beneficial effects of slavery on uncivilized Black folks. And there was a long set of arguments that you could make. But I thought, well, this is the 1990s. Who would possibly know the pro-slavery argument? Who would possibly be able to? So I asked the students, like, what could a pro-slavery argument look like? And all these hands shot up, right, for undergraduates. And they didn't say it, they weren't articulating it as views that they believed, but they knew those arguments. And I remember thinking, where am I? Like, I realized that I was in a different place, that there's certain ideas about race that could persist. They're not from the Northeast, which is where I was coming from. So when you think about these as medical students at University of Virginia, you have to wonder, well, where are those students from? And where are the beliefs from that are manifesting themselves in the first and second years? Anyway, that's a long answer to your question, but I think there's an answer somewhere in there.
Absolutely, there's an answer. And similarly, I would encourage the student who asked to maybe do a project on that, because it seems like there's so much out there. And I think you actually did a wonderful job of sketching out where future inquiry could lead. So I have one question from a student who is really, well, actually we had a number of students who are quite struck by the role that the courts kept playing in each of these epochs that you were talking about. And I'll sort of combine two different questions that we got. The first is sort of, the courts, if they're the ones that are ultimately determining the scales of pain and the validity of pain, and this continues to be something that we see, how can this one group in power begin not to just reform, but tear down and rebuild a better process for determining the way that pain is approached, especially from the perspective of the patient, the medical provider, and politicians who have their hand in this as well. And just a broader question, should the courts be the ones to adjudicate this pain, is the sort of second question. And you can take the question in any direction you'd like, but would love to hear your feedback on that.
Yeah, so, so I'll take you back to the creation of this book, because when I started writing a book about the politics of pain, I thought that it would be a story about science and medicine that might involve, these larger social, legislative, and judicial processes. And then I was stunned that from the inception, it's really courts. And what I would say is that in some ways, it reflects the intractable and difficult problem of judging and measuring and relieving pain. I mean, in the law, you have a concept of legal relief, and in medicine, you have a concept of relief. And, it's one thing to say that we want to create a society where people have access to relief, but if there are legal processes that determine one's access to relief, things like the Affordable Care Act, right, then by necessity, one needs to access the courts in order to win the right for relief, especially if there is not even if there's no consensus in medicine. If you're denied access, one needs access to, relief, and the courts. So it became clear that it makes sense that the courts play this role. The other thing I would say is that it is, that Justice John Brown in the 1950s, who articulates a fairly radical understanding of who deserves relief that I found quite shocking. I mean, Eisenhower appointee, but he's behind a lot of liberal reforms of the 1960s, and the Fifth Circuit is known as like one of the leading edges of liberal transformation, deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, taking the state governments to task for not serving the mentally ill appropriately. I mean, they become accused of judicial activism later by the Reagan era conservatives, right? And in some ways, the Reagan agenda is organized around tying the hands of judges by creating things like mandatory sentencing guidelines, because they feel that judges are exercising too much latitude. So there is an interesting history of the way in which a whole cohort of judges are leading this effort, and then the pushback is really against the judiciary as much as it's against people in pain, because it's the judiciary. So should the judges? Well, I don't see another answer, because we are talking about, legal rights, right? That access services that have their foundation in ethical commitments, right? So in that sense, but to circle all the way back, I'd say that by the time I finished the book, I was surprised to what extent I had written a legal history of pain. I did not go in, and that's, I guess, a message to any of us doing a project, which is be open to where the project leads you. Because when I wrote a legal history, I wrote a political history of pain, I really did think that it would be science and medicine leading the way, rather than, now I understand them as like riding in the caboose of social change, being led by these legal social forces.
That makes so much sense. Thank you for that. And I love that illustration at the end, for sure. So now I'd like to turn it over to Andrew Tan, who has a question for you.
Hi, Professor Wailoo. Thanks for such an informative talk on the history of pain. I really appreciated the way you described pain as something that exposes the problem of weighing objective and subjective evidence, really forces us to confront subjectivity. And with that in mind, my question is, with pain being such a subjective experience and you having done all this history of pain, how do you imagine our conception of pain, both societally and clinically, evolving as we continue to recognize the validity of things such as emotional trauma or mental illness that kind of tread even deeper into the realm of subjectivity?
Yeah. So sorry, I have a unstable connection. Are you hear me okay? Okay. That's a great question. And yep, okay. So that's a great question. One of the challenges in this book was bracketing off suffering or emotional pain, partly because it is so complicated. And yet, at the same time, from the 1990s onward, this idea of sort of mental health parity has sort of, and the rising attention to things like depression, and sort of the idea that depression hurts and causes pain, has compelled a broader conversation about whether that psychogenic overlay, right, which was so quickly dismissed, ought not to have the same kind of significance and primacy in the clinical and social policy discussion as organic pain. So where do I see it evolving? I mean, I guess what I'd say is, given my framing, which is a kind of a push and a pull between the liberal social tendencies of recognizing people in pain as legitimate and worthy of relief, and that lingering, and it's not always that lingering, right? Sometimes it's a very dominant skepticism that says, if we open this door, where will it lead? And we, so in some ways, what I see evolving is I see that tension evolving. I used to think that, you know, hopefully we were on a trajectory of better, sort of more expansive compassion and understanding. But inevitably, what I realize is that every time we have one of those expanded, you know, moments, we also have a kind of a pushback. And now, you know, if you were to track where we are now, I think we're at a very positive and hopeful moment, both in sort of macro politics of pain, but also in the micro politics of pain, when in fact something might be done. But you know, this doesn't even recognizing sort of emotional pain or psychic pain as real pain doesn't get to the other aspect of the question, which is what kind of relief is necessary, efficacious, right, and wise. So even in the history of organic pain, there's this kind of sense that you know, extreme bed rest, right, is actually not necessarily good. And so that conservative critique that says people, it doesn't matter how much pain you're in, you should get up and work and do something with yourself, right? Like that has translated into some medical advice relating to how best to deal with chronic pain. So I guess that I'm not so much answering your question because I don't see it evolving in a very specific direction, but I see the tensions always at work.
Hey, Keith, thank you so much for this great talk. I can't resist asking one question of my own, and then I'm going to go to one of our students again. You talked about fetal pain at one end of the life spectrum, and you also talked about, you know, Dr. Death and that whole issue. But one thing you didn't mention was the question of executions.
Yeah.
And the whether, you know, having pain when you're being executed somehow changes the equation of what the state should be doing, so that if we can execute people with no pain, somehow that's okay, but if it hurts them, it's not. I'm just curious about whether that plays into your story at all.
Yeah, you'll find it fleetingly in my book, but it's there, because there may be two ways in which it shows up. Because in some ways it's a story about the role of the state, not in relief, but in causing pain. And one of the factors that made lethal injection both morally acceptable to many people is the fact that you know, the combination of drugs you administered were a relaxant, a pain medicine, and then a medicine to actually stop your respiration and heart. And a lot of the controversies that flared up in the early 2000s and 1990s were about complete mismanagement of that process, during which you could see someone being put to death, flailing and being in extraordinary pain. And that provoked two things, which is it provoked a decision on the part of medicine, organized medicine, to ask, is it ethical because you need to have a medical practitioner carry out those procedures. Is it ethical to do that? And you know, and so in some ways, you might say the debate about lethal injection became in part a debate about the ethics of medical care and the ethics of pain in the course. Now, I haven't looked at it really deeply, but once again, a topic that somebody should look at, because it turns out that the question about, what pains are legitimate, and is it legitimate to inflict pain, right? Is this considered cruel and unusual? Ends up being the linchpin for the question of not physician-assisted suicide, but lethal injection and execution. And it plays out differently in different states as well. So that's why I'd say that it's not a topic I deal with in great detail in this book, but it's one that, yeah, in retrospect, I kind of wish I had touched on. But somebody should write about this.
Are you listening, PhD students? I'd like to now ask Jeremy Kim if you'd like to ask your question.
Oh, hello. Thank you so much for the talk. I definitely learned a lot. And one of the things I recently heard about the opioid crisis was that we overprescribed pain medication. And another one of the interesting ideas I heard in your talk was the importance of validating a patient's experience. So I'm wondering, how do doctors strike that balance between validating someone's experience, but also making sure they don't harm them in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the very last chapter of my book is called Oxycontin Unleashed, and it is the story of the combination of overprescription and under-medication. Because I think one of the things I would say about the opioid crisis is it illuminates a problem that we have in medicine, where either we think that opioids are underutilized because doctors feel as if they may produce unintended side effects, or they are over-prescribed. And the way medicine has worked is it moves from one end of, it's like a pendulum swing. You go from over-prescription to under-prescription, but this is not actually a recipe for serving anyone, right? Because so the hard part is figuring out how you balance opioid prescription. How do you distinguish between the places when it should be used and the places when it shouldn't be used? So this is all to say that there's a kind of a really interesting politics of overprescription. There's another interesting story to be told about opioids, which is how did we get to a situation where we have an opioid crisis? And to what extent is it really driven by overprescription? To what extent is it driven by, let's see, Purdue Pharma and inappropriate medical education? Or to what extent is it driven, like the fentanyl phenomenon is not a prescription problem, right? Fentanyl is not a prescribed drug. So what some scholars argue is that when we think about the opioid crisis, we need to think about actually very different crises. There's prescriptions, there's fentanyl, and then of course there's other forms of, anyway, it's hard for me to kind of come up with a concise answer to your question, which is a really good one, because I have that whole chapter, which is about this tension between over medication and under prescription. And the last thing I'll say is this often has these perverse racial effects. So in the earliest days of the opioid crisis, it was called hillbilly heroin. The idea being that it was like rural Appalachia where you were seeing the largest phenomenon of opioid abuse. And then more recently, it's become characterized as kind of like a white rural problem. And I actually had a colleague of mine, and this gets back to the Whose Pain Matters story. I had a colleague of mine and a journalist once asked me, well, we know that African Americans and Latinos are underprescribed for pain in emergency room settings, right? Like that's been documented. So he said, isn't it true then that by being underprescribed, you're actually helping Black people or Latinos because they're not getting addicted in the same way that whites did. And I thought, well, this is really weird, right? This is like saying that because rural whites have been adversely affected by one prescription drug, that means that denying that prescription drug to other people, you are helping them, even if they're in legitimate pain in an ER setting. Or so to me, the problem of overprescription and underprescription can sometimes lead in these perverse directions where you say, well, yes, clearly opioids are a problem, therefore we deny to everyone. I had a colleague whose mom was at the end of her life and dying in South Carolina, and was in at home care and had become addicted to Oxycontin, but she fell and ended up in the hospital, right? But the hospital's rules determined that she could not be continued on her Oxycontin because they were so anxious about addiction. And we're talking about an elderly woman who has cancer, who's dying, and who happens to be also addicted. So part of the problem that I see with the politics of over medication and under medication is the inability to grapple with these complexities and the importance of grappling with these complexities.
Okay, gosh, we've only got a few minutes. I can't resist just saying that I had a hip replacement 2 years ago, and I went through this same set of issues because they prescribe Oxycontin as a pain reliever, oxycodone, and it's very painful recovering from it. But after 2 weeks, they began to try to wean me off it, and I was not done hurting. But California's laws make it extremely difficult for them to continue prescribing after that period of time. So, I was not a guy who was going to end up addicted to this, but there was no way around the legal structure that made it impossible to continue that drug. I want to for our last question, I want to turn it over to Jayla.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay? My connection's kind of bad today.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, we hear you fine.
Thanks so much, Professor Wailoo. I really appreciated your talk. And it specifically resonated with me because my grandmother actually had a very intensive back surgery in her 20s that, required her to have opioids that she also became addicted to. And it was a very haphazard experience for her. And she had to go through the process of fighting off this addiction by herself because she just didn't have those resources. So, and the ways that the doctors treated her were very similar to what you described, just in terms of how they described her pain and how they dismissed her experiences. So I just want to know if there should be more direct medical education, or maybe just education on all levels. So in undergrad, perhaps in elementary and middle schools, that combat these pervasive oral histories and ingrained ideas of racial difference in pain. I think that the topics of race and science or race and medicine can be danced around, so people don't really outwardly say, these are stereotypes against these groups and they are not true. Therefore, the oral histories kind of continue to sustain themselves. So do you think that direct education and classes maybe that specifically talk about and dispel these stereotypes would be enough to fundamentally change people's understanding?
I think it would be a start. And I also think that, when I was teaching in Chapel Hill in North Carolina, I taught in the history department. I gave you one anecdote about that, but I was also teaching in the medical school. And the very first time I taught a course on pain, I taught it to second year medical students, a very small seminar because we had room in the curriculum for that. And no one taught about pain. So here I am, a kind of historian and a sociologist of science in a medical school teaching about pain. And one of my students went on later on into a kind of a internship over at Duke in a pain clinic. And the physician who was a resident said, where did you learn about you're learning about pain in your curriculum, because it's really uncharted territory. It seeps in to the way in which students think, but there is very little concerted, focused attention to the question of pain. And so it makes sense then that you might say these inherited or culturally resonant ways of thinking about difference and pain should persist, because there's not much really engaging with them in the realm of science education. The other thing I will say is that I've always believed that the place you develop and shape medical practitioners who are adept at dealing with these issues is before they get to medical school. And the way you actually deal with, you shape the conversation, I understand now, is by talking to people who are going into law or going into other realms of society with a kind of understanding of these social and moral and ethical complexies. Because I think by the time you get to medical school, I wouldn't say it's too late, but that has a kind of professionalizing force that sometimes there's not enough time for these kinds of deep conversations to happen. So I guess that's what I would say, is that there is, I always have hope about education, but I also recognize that these are like lifelong challenges that we as professors, students, lifelong students, I consider myself a lifelong student, grapple. And also, that education isn't just what happens in the classroom, it's also what happens, in the course of your everyday life when you're engaging with others.
Thank you so much. That was extremely helpful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, unfortunately, this is a fascinating conversation. I'd love to keep going for another hour, but we're past our time, and we need to let our students go. And so, Keith, if you'll just stay on for a few minutes, we'll debrief a bit. And
Sure.
Everybody else, thank you for your participation, and we'll see you next week.